Sometimes the justice system fails and criminals who have been caught for crimes are set free due to an oversight or other technicality. But it usually doesn't take long for those individuals to end up on the wrong side of the law again. Number 5. In December of 2019, the case against Michael Weir made history at the Old Bailey, which is the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, situated in London. Weir stood accused of 2 separate burglaries that were committed 5 weeks apart. It was alleged that he entered the house of 78-year-old Leonard Harris and 83-year-old Rose Safarian, where he assaulted both victims in a bid to rob them of their valuables in order to buy narcotics. In both cases, the victims were so severely injured that they succumbed to their injuries, and Weir made off with a ring, a gold watch, a wedding band, cash, as well as diamond rings, which he then sold. At both crime scenes, a palm print was found, but police didn't connect the 2 crimes, as the print found at Harris's home was of inferior quality. Weir was convicted of Harris's murder in 1999 thanks to a DNA match, but it was found that the DNA data was kept in the police's database by mistake, though a judge ruled that the evidence was in fact admissible. In 2000, however, this decision was overturned after an appeal was filed and Weir was set free. Then in 2017, the 2 palm prints were finally matched and new DNA evidence was found, putting Weir at both crime scenes. While standing trial, Weir admitted that he'd been in the habit of stealing in order to support his drug habit for a very long time, but he denied being at either Harris's or Safarian's properties, though he would not give an explanation as to why his DNA and prints were found at both scenes. 19 years after committing the crimes, Weir was finally sentenced to 30 years in prison in a trial that's labeled as the first ever double jeopardy case of its kind. Upon being arrested for the crimes once again, Weir stated that he felt extremely angry and upset at his decision. Number 4. On April 10, 2001, South African man Peter Villian left his home early in the morning and headed out to his job as a panel beater. Before leaving, however, he removed his utility knife from his toolbox and kept it with him as he got into his car. He then drove about 550 yards down the road, stopped his car, got out and walked back to his house where his 5-month pregnant wife was sleeping. Once he was back inside, Villian climbed through a window he'd broken and entered the couple's bedroom where he would use the utility knife to end the life of his wife. He then exited the house, walked back to his car, and drove to work. Upon being arrested, Villian confessed to the crime and explained to police in detail what he had done. But when his case finally made it to trial, he changed his plea to not guilty, claiming that he'd been tortured by police and that in reality, he had nothing to do with his wife's demise. The judge who was overseeing his trial agreed that Villian had suffered a violation to his constitutional rights, and he was acquitted. The state disagreed and filed an appeal, to which the Court of Appeals agreed, stating that a trial within a trial would need not to be held. This would help determine whether Villian's confession was forced, and it was found that in fact it had not been. After a retrial, Villian was sentenced to 22 years in prison. He still denies having any involvement in his wife's death. Number 3. By 2009, Jose Garcia Zarate had been deported from the United States 5 times, and he'd racked up a total of 7 felony convictions in his name. He came from Mexico, and in 1991, he was convicted 3 times on drug-related charges. He was deported back to Mexico in 1994, 97, 98, 2003, and again in 2009. Only 3 months after being deported for the 5th time, Garcia Zarate attempted to enter the US illegally again, but he was apprehended and ordered to be held at a federal medical facility. Therefore, he was sent to San Bernardino County, where he served time for crossing the border illegally. Then in 2015, he was turned over to authorities in San Francisco to take further charges against him. The US Immigration and Customs Enforcement requested that Garcia Zarate be kept in custody until he could be deported once again, but San Francisco adheres to a due process for all ordinance, so he couldn't be held unless he had committed a violent crime, so he was set free. On the 1st of July in 2015, Garcia Zarate was walking along Pier 14 after ingesting a few sleeping pills which he had found in a trash can. Being homeless, he sat down on a bench and says that he found a .40 caliber gun wrapped in a t-shirt under the bench that he was sitting on. While holding the gun, it fired unexpectedly, traveled down the pier and struck the concrete where it ricocheted, hitting a young woman named Catherine in the back while she was walking with her father. Her father performed CPR until paramedics arrived, but she succumbed to her injuries in the hospital 2 hours later. Garcia Zarate threw the gun off the pier, but he was arrested an hour after the shooting and the gun was recovered. He was charged with first-degree murder and he pleaded not guilty. He would later give conflicting accounts of the incident, first stating that he was aiming the gun at sea lions, then later stating the gun went off as he picked it up. A charge of being a felon in possession of a firearm was added to Garcia Zarate's case, and he was eventually tried on this charge as well as second-degree murder. If he were to be found guilty, he would have spent the rest of his life in prison, but after deliberating for 5 days, a jury found him not guilty of second-degree murder. He was, however, convicted of the lesser gun charge, only for it to be overturned due to the jury not being instructed of one of Garcia Zarate's defenses. A week later, Garcia Zarate was finally convicted of being a felon and undocumented immigrant in possession of a firearm and ammunition, so he was handed over to the federal immigration authorities and he faces up to 10 years in jail. Number 2. On the evening of November the 30th, 2016, 77-year-old Willis Sample and his wife Edna, age 73, had just returned from the store and were unloading groceries from their car, a Mercury Grand Marquis. While they were unpacking, Donald Clark and an accomplice entered their house armed with a rifle and a handgun and demanded money from the couple. Willis gave the men $600, after which they broke into the couple's gun case from where they stole Willis's weapons before demanding the keys to their car, which they'd used to make their escape after tying up the couple. Edna was not injured during the robbery, and Willis suffered some minor injuries, but shortly after the incident, he suffered a heart attack and passed away. It was determined that his heart attack was a direct result of the stress caused by the robbery, and his death was labeled as a homicide. After his arrest, Clark admitted to committing the robbery, and he was found competent to stand trial for murder. However, a forensic psychologist determined that his confession should not be admissible, as he was not able to understand what he was doing when he waived his Miranda rights during his confession. This meant that Clark's confession was meaningless, and there were no further grounds to go forward with the trial. Willis's daughter, Nona Short, would later express her outrage, stating that it made no sense that Clark was found competent to stand trial, but lacked the capacity to understand his Miranda rights. The district attorney's office requested that the case be dismissed, and a Tuscaloosa County Circuit Court judge made the ruling in favor of Clark. During the 2.5 years that Clark spent in jail, he studied for his GED. Then on the 4th of September 2019, just 2.5 months after being released, a man wearing a backpack entered a convenience store where he was approached by 2 men who demanded to know what he had in the backpack. He tried to avoid them, but one of the men tried to punch him and demanded that he hand the bag over to them. He decided to flee, and as he ran, he heard someone yell, "Shoot him," before being struck in the leg by a bullet. When asked to look at the photo lineups, the man identified Clark as the one who tried to punch him, and who shouted at his accomplice to shoot him. Both men were arrested, and Clark was charged with first-degree robbery, while his accomplice faced a charge of attempted murder and first-degree robbery. Number 1. James Howard, Karen Wolf, and Lucia McGirt were all members of a Native American tribe based in Oklahoma. On March 2, 2004, after celebrating a party on the previous evening, they were asleep in Howard's house when they were approached by David Magnan, a member of another tribe accompanied by 2 other men. Magnan was armed with a pistol, and upon entering the house, he found Howard where he was still in bed, uttered the words "goodbye," and shot him multiple times. He then continued through the house, locating McGirt and Wolf in another bedroom where he fired at them as well. McGirt would initially survive the attack, and she identified Magnan as the one who had committed the crime before she passed away 2 weeks later. Following the shooting, Magnan and his accomplices fled the scene and did their best to hide the gun that was used in the shooting, but it was eventually recovered by police. Magnan was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of shooting with intent to kill. Before his trial, he stated that he wanted to plead to all counts and asked that he be given the death penalty. This prompted a psychological evaluation to be carried out, and he was found fit to stand trial. During the evaluation, it was found that he only had a 7th grade education, but despite this, the trial would go ahead. At his plea hearing, he told the judge that if he didn't get away from people, he was going to start hurting them even more. Eventually, he was sentenced to death on each of the murder charges and given a life sentence on the shooting charge. Shortly after being convicted, he appealed the convictions, stating that the crimes had taken place on an Indian land. It was found that this was indeed the case, as the house formed part of a 200-acre property that was allotted to a member of the local tribe in the early 1900s, and so he was released from state custody. However, it was later determined that the house was in fact not part of this tribal land, and in October of 2016, U.S. District Court Judge Ronald White sentenced Magnan to 3 consecutive life sentences plus an additional 3 years, which was for an arson charge. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been tying knots, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.